Gentlemen, let me slow this thing down for a second, because this first point right here goes deeper than most people are ready to admit. When someone stays in your mind without any communication, without texts, calls, or explanations, what you're experiencing is not obsession and it's not weakness. It is an unresolved emotional bond. And unresolved emotions have a way of demanding attention, whether you invite them or not. You see, the human mind is not designed to hold on to things that never mattered. We forget faces, names, conversations, even whole phases of our life that didn't leave an emotional imprint. But when a person keeps resurfacing in your thoughts, especially in silence, that's because something meaningful was planted there and never properly uprooted or fulfilled. Closure didn't happen. Answers weren't given. Feelings weren't fully expressed or received. So the mind keeps circling back, trying to make sense of what the heart experienced. Silence actually makes emotions louder. When communication stops, your imagination fills the gaps. You replay moments, analyze words, re-examine actions, and question intentions. Not because you want to suffer, but because your mind is searching for resolution. It wants to understand what something meant, why it ended the way it did, and what role it played in shaping you. That's not weakness. That's emotional intelligence trying to complete a story. A lot of people think healing means forgetting. That's wrong. Healing means understanding. And you can't understand something you never fully processed. When there's no communication, there's no new information to replace old memories. So the past stays active. The connection remains mentally alive, even if it's physically absent. What makes this even stronger is that emotional bonds don't require daily contact to survive. Feelings aren't powered by Wi-Fi. They're powered by impact. If someone impacted your self-worth, your sense of love, your vision of the future, or the way you saw yourself, that influence doesn't disappear just because communication stopped. It stays stored in your emotional memory. And let me tell you something else people don't like to hear. Sometimes the reason someone stays on your mind is because they represented something you wanted: safety, validation, excitement, understanding, or love, whether they gave it consistently or not. The mind holds on to symbols as much as people. So you're not always missing the person. Sometimes you're missing how they made you feel or who you were becoming around them. Unresolved emotional bonds also show up when boundaries were unclear, when love was inconsistent, when affection came with confusion, when you were left guessing instead of feeling secure. The mind hates confusion. It tries to solve it over and over again, hoping that one day the answer will finally make sense. That's why silence can feel heavier than rejection. At least rejection gives you a full stop. Silence leaves a comma. And here's the part that sets people free if they're brave enough to accept it. Just because someone lives in your mind doesn't mean they belong in your life. Sometimes they remain in your thoughts because they were part of a lesson, not a destination. A lesson about self-respect. A lesson about patience. A lesson about what love should and should not feel like. Your mind revisits what your heart hasn't learned from yet. Once the lesson is absorbed, once the emotional bond is understood instead of questioned, the grip loosens naturally, not overnight, not forcefully, but gradually. The thoughts become quieter. The emotional charge fades. And one day you realize you're not fighting the memory anymore. It simply doesn't control you. So if he's always in your mind without communication, understand this: it means something mattered, something shifted, and something is still being processed. Don't rush it. Don't shame yourself for it. Use it, learn from it. Because unresolved emotions aren't there to torture you. They're there to teach you something about yourself that you couldn't have learned any other way. Ladies and gentlemen, let me take you deeper into this second point, because this is where most people misunderstand what silence really does. Silence does not erase connection. Silence magnifies unfinished feelings. When communication stops, when there are no more messages or explanations, the emotional bond doesn't automatically disappear. In many cases, it actually becomes louder. The absence creates space, and in that space, emotions rise to the surface. You see, communication can sometimes distract us from what we truly feel. When someone is present, when they are talking to you regularly, you're busy responding, reacting, adjusting, and compromising. But when that communication suddenly ends, there's nothing left to distract you from your inner experience. No new words to override old ones. No new moments to replace the memories that already exist. So the feelings that were pushed aside now demand to be felt. Unfinished feelings are powerful because they don't have an ending. They sit in the background, quietly influencing your thoughts, your mood, and your decisions. When silence enters, your mind starts replaying moments, not because you want to live in the past, but because the story feels incomplete. The heart wants closure, and when it doesn't get it, it keeps knocking on the door of your awareness. Silence also has a way of stripping away illusion. When someone is no longer communicating with you, you're forced to separate reality from fantasy. You're no longer reacting to what they say today. You're reflecting on what they actually did back then. This reflection can be painful, but it's also revealing. It shows you which emotions were real and which ones were sustained by hope rather than consistency. That's why silence can feel heavier than conflict. An argument still contains engagement. Even disagreement keeps the connection active. Silence, on the other hand, leaves you alone with your truth. It asks questions you've been avoiding. Was I valued? Was I chosen? Was I enough? And when those questions don't have clear answers, the feelings intensify. Another reason silence magnifies emotion is because it removes control. When communication exists, you can ask, explain, clarify, or negotiate. When it's gone, you have no influence over the outcome. The lack of control triggers anxiety, attachment, and emotional rumination. The mind tries to regain control by thinking, analyzing, and revisiting every detail, hoping to understand what went wrong or what could have been different. Silence also creates space for emotional honesty. Without ongoing contact, you can no longer hide behind distractions. You can't pretend you're unaffected. You can't avoid the truth by staying busy with conversation. The quiet forces you to confront what you actually felt and what you were willing to tolerate. That's why silence often brings both pain and clarity at the same time. Unfinished feelings are not just about love, they're about identity. When someone mattered to you, they became part of how you saw yourself. When they disappear without resolution, it can feel like a part of you went missing too. Your mind keeps searching for that missing piece, not because you need the person, but because you're trying to understand who you are without them. And here's something people rarely acknowledge. Silence can turn potential into longing. You're not just missing what happened, you're mourning what you thought could have happened. The future you imagine never got the chance to become real, and the mind struggles to let go of possibilities that were never tested. That's why silence can feel like loss even when nothing officially ended. But silence is also honest. It doesn't lie. It doesn't distract. It doesn't sugarcoat reality. It shows you exactly how someone chooses to show up when nothing is required of them. And while that truth can hurt, it also frees you from confusion. Over time, the same silence that magnified your feelings will begin to refine them. You'll start to see which emotions were rooted in reality and which ones were rooted in hope. So when silence makes feelings louder, don't fight it. Understand it. Those unfinished emotions are not trying to break you. They're trying to be acknowledged. Once they are seen clearly, they lose their power to control you. Ladies and gentlemen, this third point touches the deepest place inside a person because the mind will always revisit what the heart never received closure from. You don't keep thinking about someone because you enjoy the pain. You keep thinking because something inside you is still unanswered. The heart experienced something meaningful, but it never got a clear ending, so the mind keeps returning to the moment, hoping clarity will finally arrive. Closure is not just about a conversation or an apology. Closure is emotional completion. It's the moment when your heart fully understands what something meant, why it happened, and where it stands now. When that moment never comes, the mind steps in and tries to finish the job. It replays memories, analyzes tone, reinterprets silence, and searches for meaning in places that may not even hold it. That's why people can move on physically, but still feel stuck mentally. You can stop talking to someone, unfollow them, delete the messages, and still feel like they're present in your thoughts. Because the heart doesn't operate on logic or timelines. The heart holds on until it understands, and if it never gets that understanding, it sends the work to the mind. The mind is a problem solver. It doesn't like open endings. When something ends without explanation, It treats it like an unfinished task, so it keeps revisiting the past, not to hurt you, but to protect you. It wants to understand what went wrong so you don't repeat the same pain again. But without closure, every memory feels incomplete, every emotion feels unresolved, and every quiet moment becomes an invitation for thoughts to return. What makes this harder is that closure often depends on someone else, and that's where people lose their power. You wait for an apology that never comes. You wait for clarity from someone who chose silence. You wait for answers from someone who already moved on. Meanwhile, your mind keeps reopening the wound, hoping that one day the missing piece will appear. And let me tell you something important. Closure doesn't always come from the other person. Sometimes it comes from understanding yourself, understanding why you stayed, understanding what you ignored, understanding what you deserve but didn't demand. But until that understanding happens, the mind will keep revisiting the story, trying to rewrite the ending. Another reason the mind goes back is because emotional moments get stored deeper than ordinary memories. When feelings are involved, especially love, hope, or vulnerability, the brain marks those moments as significant. They're not easy to let go of because they shaped your emotional identity. They taught you something about intimacy, trust, or attachment. And lessons that haven't been fully learned tend to repeat themselves in thought. The mind also revisits unresolved connections during moments of quiet, at night, during stillness, when distractions fade, because that's when you're closest to your truth. During the day, you can stay busy, you can smile, you can function. But in silence, the heart speaks and the mind listens. And if closure hasn't happened, the same thoughts resurface again and again. People often judge themselves for this. They say, why am I still thinking about him, as if it's a failure? It's not a failure. It's a signal that something emotional hasn't been processed yet. You don't need to shame yourself. You need to understand yourself. The mind is not your enemy here. It's trying to help you heal in the only way it knows how. What hurts most about lack of closure is that it creates doubt. You start questioning your worth, your decisions, your reality. You wonder if you imagined the connection, if you asked for too much, if you were not enough. And without closure, those questions linger longer than they should. The mind keeps revisiting the relationship, trying to defend you against self-blame. But here's the truth people don't always want to accept. Sometimes the lack of closure is the closure. Sometimes the silence is the answer. Sometimes the absence of explanation is the explanation. And until the heart accepts that, the mind will keep knocking, hoping for a different outcome. Once you begin to understand that closure doesn't always come wrapped in words, the grip starts to loosen. When you stop waiting for someone else to validate your experience and start validating it yourself, the mind slowly stops revisiting the past. Not because the memory disappears, but because it no longer needs your attention. The mind only revisits what the heart hasn't settled. When the heart finally understands the lesson, accepts the truth, and releases the expectation of answers, the thoughts lose their urgency. They fade not through force, but through understanding. Ladies and gentlemen, this fourth point is powerful because distance has a way of revealing what presence often hides. When someone is close, when they're accessible, familiar, and part of your routine, you don't always recognize their true value. Comfort can dull awareness. But when distance enters the picture, when someone is no longer there, the mind begins to measure what their absence really means. And that's when awareness sharpens. You see, value is often recognized in loss, not because people want pain, but because distance removes distractions. When someone is gone, you're no longer reacting to their flaws in real time. You're no longer negotiating emotions day by day. You're no longer distracted by small arguments or daily routines. What remains is the emotional impact they had on your life. The question becomes simple but heavy. What changed in me after they left? Distance strips relationships down to their essence. It removes noise and leaves meaning. You begin to notice what they added to your life, how they influenced your mood, your confidence, your sense of being seen. And sometimes only in their absence do you realize how much emotional weight they carried in your world. That's why distance can make feelings feel stronger, not weaker. It's not always because the person was perfect. It's because they represented something important at a certain stage of your life. They may have arrived when you needed connection, affirmation, or hope. And when they leave, the gap they leave behind becomes more visible than their presence ever was. Distance also exposes emotional dependence versus emotional appreciation. When someone is around, you may take their presence for granted. You assume they'll always be there. But when distance arrives, the mind starts asking questions. Did I value them enough? Did I speak my truth? Did I recognize what they offered, or did I only focus on what they lacked? These reflections aren't meant to punish you. They're meant to teach awareness. Another thing distance does is separate fantasy from reality. When someone is no longer present, you're forced to confront who they truly were to you, not who you hoped they would become. Sometimes distance increases value because it reveals consistency you didn't notice before. Other times, it reveals that you were holding on to potential, not reality. Either way, distance clarifies. And let's be honest, distance removes ego. When someone is no longer reachable, you can't perform, you can't impress, you can't influence their perception. You're left alone with how you truly feel without the need to protect pride. That's when you realize whether the connection mattered or whether it was just convenience. Distance also heightens emotional memory. Moments you once overlooked become significant. Small gestures feel larger in hindsight. Conversations replay with new meaning. Not because you're romanticizing the past, but because your mind is re-evaluating impact. You start to see how that person shaped your emotional environment, even in subtle ways. And sometimes, distance reveals your own value. You realize how much you gave, how much you adjusted, how much you tolerated. You begin to see yourself more clearly because you're no longer trying to be understood by someone else. The absence gives you perspective, and perspective brings truth. Distance doesn't just make you miss people, it makes you miss versions of yourself. The way you laughed, the way you hoped, the way you imagined the future. And when those parts feel distant, the mind associates that loss with the person who was present during that time. That's why thoughts return. You're not just remembering them, you're remembering who you were when you felt alive, desired, or understood. There's also something important about delayed realization. Humans often don't recognize value in real time. We recognize it when it's no longer accessible. Distance removes availability, and availability is often mistaken for permanence. Once something is no longer guaranteed, the mind reassesses its worth. But here's the truth that brings balance. Distance doesn't always mean the person was meant to stay. Sometimes it simply means they were meant to show you what you value, not necessarily be the one who provides it forever. Awareness doesn't always lead to reunion. Sometimes it leads to growth. Distance teaches discernment. It shows you what you truly want in a connection, what you cannot compromise on, and what you must protect next time. It reveals patterns, needs, and emotional blind spots. And once that awareness sets in, the pain shifts into understanding. When distance makes you more aware, it's not trying to pull you backward. It's trying to sharpen your vision forward. The clarity you gain from absence is meant to guide your future, not trap you in the past. The value you recognize becomes a standard, not a regret. Distance doesn't lie. It doesn't manipulate. It simply reflects truth back to you. And whatever truth you see in that reflection is something your soul was ready to understand. Ladies and gentlemen, this fifth point goes straight to the core of human attachment because emotional connection does not require daily contact to stay alive. A lot of people believe that love, attachment, or emotional bonds survive only through constant communication. But that's not how emotions work. Emotions are not sustained by messages, they are sustained by meaning. And when a connection carried meaning, it doesn't disappear just because communication ends. You see, real emotional attachment is formed through moments of vulnerability, through shared experiences, through times when you felt seen, understood, or valued in a way that touched your spirit. Once that happens, the bond moves beyond surface level interaction. It becomes internal. It lives inside you. And once something lives inside you, distance cannot erase it easily. That's why you can go days, weeks, even months without talking to someone and still feel their presence in your thoughts. Because the connection was never just about conversation. It was about emotional impact. It was about how that person made you feel about yourself when they were around. And feelings like that don't need reminders to exist. They resurface naturally. Emotional attachment is also stored in memory differently than ordinary experiences. The brain records emotionally charged moments more deeply. Laughter, intimacy, trust, disappointment, hope. These moments leave imprints. And when communication stops, those imprints don't fade. They become more noticeable because there's no new interaction to replace them. Another reason emotional attachment survives without contact is because it often connects to unmet needs. Maybe that person fulfilled something you were missing at the time. Reassurance, excitement, comfort, validation. Even if they didn't give it consistently, the moments they did were powerful enough to create attachment. When communication ends, the need doesn't disappear just because the person did. So the emotional bond stays active in your mind. People often confuse emotional attachment with dependency, but they're not the same. Attachment doesn't always mean you need someone to function. Sometimes it means they were present during a significant emotional chapter of your life. And chapters don't erase themselves just because the page turns. They remain part of the story. Silence can even strengthen emotional attachment because it leaves room for imagination. When someone is no longer present, you fill the gaps with memories, meaning, and what-ifs. You remember the good moments more vividly. You replay the highs more than the lows. This doesn't mean you're ignoring reality. It means your mind is holding on to emotional safety. There's also a biological side to this. Emotional bonds are reinforced by chemistry. Hormones released during connection don't immediately disappear when contact ends. The body remembers closeness. The nervous system remembers familiarity. And until your system recalibrates, the attachment remains active internally. Another hard truth is that emotional attachment often survives when emotional expression was incomplete, when feelings weren't fully shared, when affection wasn't fully reciprocated, or when love wasn't fully explored. The attachment lingers. The heart keeps wondering what could have been, not because it's unrealistic, but because it never got the chance to reach its natural end. This is why emotional attachment can feel confusing. You know logically that communication has ended, but emotionally it feels unfinished. The mind understands absence, but the heart remembers connection. And when the heart remembers, it doesn't check timelines or circumstances. It simply feels. What people don't talk about enough is that emotional attachment can also exist without intention. You don't choose to become attached. It happens gradually, through shared energy, through repeated emotional experiences. And once it forms, it doesn't vanish just because you decide it should. But here's the empowering part. Emotional attachment surviving without contact doesn't mean you're stuck forever. It means your heart needs time to detach at its own pace. Detachment is not an act of force, it's an act of understanding. As you begin to understand what the connection truly represented, the attachment slowly loosens. Over time, as you create new emotional experiences, your system learns safety again. The attachment doesn't disappear suddenly, it softens, it becomes quieter. It stops dominating your thoughts, not because the connection wasn't real, but because it has been processed. And let me be clear about this. Emotional attachment staying alive without contact does not mean the other person feels the same. It only means the connection mattered to you. And that matters. Your feelings are valid even if the outcome wasn't what you hoped for. The danger is not in having emotional attachment. The danger is in judging yourself for it. When you shame yourself, you resist healing. When you accept the attachment as part of your emotional journey, healing begins naturally. Emotional attachment doesn't make you weak. It means you're capable of connection. It means you felt deeply. And feeling deeply is not a flaw, it's a strength. The goal is not to stop feeling. The goal is to feel, understand, and then choose growth. So if someone remains in your heart without communication, recognize it for what it is. A bond that once held meaning, a chapter that shaped you, a connection that taught you something about love, about yourself, about what you value. With time, clarity replaces attachment. Understanding replaces longing. And what once felt like emotional weight becomes emotional wisdom. Ladies and gentlemen, this sixth point is where everything comes together because repeated thoughts are never random. When someone stays on your mind again and again without communication, without new memories being created, it's a sign that something inside you is unfinished, a lesson, a decision, or a truth is still waiting to be faced. The mind does not repeat what has been resolved. It repeats what has been avoided. You see, the brain is designed to protect you, not torture you. When a thought keeps returning, it's not trying to hurt you. It's trying to highlight something you haven't fully understood yet. Something important was experienced, but its meaning hasn't been fully integrated into who you are now. So the mind keeps bringing it back, hoping this time you'll see it differently. Sometimes the lesson is about boundaries. Maybe you gave more than you received. Maybe you ignored red flags because you didn't want to lose the connection. The mind repeats the memory not to reopen the wound, but to remind you where you crossed yourself to keep someone else comfortable. Until you acknowledge that truth, the thought stays active. Sometimes the lesson is about self-worth. You may have accepted inconsistency, silence, or emotional absence because you believed love required sacrifice. The repeated thoughts are your inner voice asking you to reevaluate what you believe you deserve. Until that belief shifts, the mind keeps revisiting the situation, trying to correct the narrative. Other times, the unfinished business is a decision you didn't make. You waited. You hoped. You stayed emotionally available when the situation was unclear. And because you never chose fully for yourself, the mind keeps replaying the past, asking, what if? Not because the past is better, but because you never closed the door with intention. Repeated thoughts also show up when truth was avoided. Maybe deep down you knew the connection wasn't balanced. Maybe you sensed that effort wasn't mutual. But accepting that truth would have required letting go, and letting go felt more painful than staying uncertain. So the mind keeps revisiting the relationship, pushing you toward honesty. A lot of people think they need answers from the other person to move on. But many times, the answer is already inside you. The mind repeats the story until you accept what you already know but haven't wanted to face. Silence, inconsistency, distance, these are also answers. And until they are accepted as such, the mind keeps knocking. Repeated thoughts can also mean there's an emotional pattern being revealed. The person on your mind may not be the first to make you feel this way. They may represent a familiar dynamic. Being emotionally unavailable, giving love hope and it will change someone, confusing intensity with intimacy. The mind brings this person back to show you the pattern, not the individual. This is why forcing yourself to stop thinking never works. You can't silence a message without reading it. The thought isn't the problem, the meaning behind it is. Once the meaning is understood, the thought loses its grip naturally. Another truth people avoid is that repeated thoughts sometimes signal grief. Not just grief over losing a person, but grief over losing a version of yourself. The version that believed, the version that hoped, the version that imagined a future that never arrived. Until that grief is acknowledged, the mind keeps returning to where it began. Repeated thoughts also appear when growth is happening. When you're transitioning emotionally, the mind revisits old attachments to compare them with who you're becoming. It's asking, does this still fit? And until the answer becomes clear, the thought stays. There's also fear involved. Fear of choosing differently next time. Fear of trusting again. Fear of repeating the same pain. The mind replays the past trying to protect you from future mistakes. But protection without understanding turns into rumination. What changes everything is when you stop asking why the person is on your mind and start asking what your mind is trying to teach you. Is it asking you to choose yourself? Is it asking you to let go of hope that keeps you stuck? Is it asking you to raise your standards? Is it asking you to forgive yourself? Once you answer that question honestly, the repetition softens. The thought no longer needs to shout because it has been heard. Repeated thoughts are not a sign you should go back. They are a sign you should go deeper within, deeper into your values, deeper into your boundaries, deeper into self-respect. When the lesson is learned, the thought doesn't disappear completely, but it loses emotional charge. It becomes a memory, not a pull. The mind only keeps what serves a purpose. When the purpose is fulfilled, the mind releases it. Not through force, not through denial, but through clarity. So if someone keeps appearing in your thoughts without communication, understand this clearly. Your soul is asking for alignment. Your heart is asking for honesty. And your mind is asking you to complete what was left unfinished, not by reopening the door, but by closing it with understanding.